Hong Kong is in chaos. People are in the streets every weekend. Marches and rallies during the day become violent rampages at night. They wear masks. They barricade roads and destroy public property. They set fires in the street. They collect bricks from the sidewalk and throw them at the police. They make petrol bombs with glass bottles and throw them at the police and at government buildings. They break into and destroy the offices of government officials. And American flags can be seen in the streets. How did this happen? Why are protesters demanding U.S. sanctions on their own city? Let's unmask Hong Kong's anti-government movement and find out. The first massive march happened in June of 2019, following a law change proposed by Chief Executive Carrie Lam, who said she didn't receive any instructions to do so from Beijing. Now, that same day, the United States warned that the proposed amendment could endanger its citizens in Hong Kong and threatened that it would retaliate by re-examining Hong Kong's preferential economic status as compared to the mainland.
We are also concerned that the amendments could damage Hong Kong's business environment and subject our citizens residing in or visiting Hong Kong to China's capricious judicial system. The continued erosion of the one country, two systems framework puts at risk Hong Kong's long-established special status in international affairs.
But let's take a closer look at this amendment to extradition law and its misconceptions. A pregnant young woman named Poon Hugh Wing went to Taiwan with her boyfriend, a Hong Konger named Chang Tong Kai. When he learned she slept with another man, he strangles her to death, stuffs her in a suitcase, and dumps it in some bushes. He returns to Hong Kong, but because Hong Kong doesn't have an extradition agreement with Taiwan, he remains free. This is the case that the Hong Kong government cites when proposing the infamous extradition bill. What the bill would do is allow Hong Kong to surrender fugitives like Chang Tong Kai on a case-by-case basis to any territory with which the region doesn't already have an extradition treaty. That includes Taiwan, and it includes mainland China. Opposition politicians immediately claimed that Beijing would use this bill to jail political dissidents. And the Western corporate press seemed to be under that impression as well, that the extradition bill was a sign of China's creeping authoritarianism.
Government tried to introduce legislation allowing defendants to be extradited to mainland China, where courts are controlled by the ruling Communist Party.
They control media, they control the economy, they control no criticism allowed against the Communist Chinese.
The Chinese government will use the new law to silence its political opponents.
I asked a high-ranking Hong Kong lawmaker and the former Secretary of Security if there was any truth to this claim, that with the bill, China would be able to jail political dissidents. The opposition claims that it would allow political dissidents to be jailed in mainland China. Is there any truth to that?
No truth whatsoever. You know, our amendment legislation only expands the geographical coverage of the existing legislation, which was enacted before 1997 and fully compliant with international human rights standards.
Now, the extradition bill was tabled and even then declared dead by Hong Kong Chief Executive Carrie Lam.
I have almost immediately put a stop to the amendment exercise. But there are still lingering doubts about the government's sincerity or worries whether the government will restart the process in the Legislative Council. So I reiterate here, there is no such plan. The bill is dead.
But the protests continued and escalated. Unsatisfied protesters created a list of 5 demands: the full official withdrawal of the extradition bill, for the government to stop designating the protesters as rioters, unconditional amnesty for everyone arrested and jailed so far, for the government to start an independent investigation into police brutality outside its existing complaints council, and for immediate universal suffrage. Soon, it became dangerous to even voice opposition to these protesters. Western politicians became very vocal about their support for these demonstrations.
The United States stands with the democratic protesters in Hong Kong.
The protesters in Hong Kong have sent a stirring message to the rest of the world about the dreams of freedom and justice.
In Hong Kong, these are protesters who are simply seeking liberty and freedom.
But maybe it's ironic that the West is now supporting a democracy movement in Hong Kong. In the late 1700s, the British East India Company, the largest transnational corporation of its time, was selling opium in China illegally. Millions of Chinese people became addicted, including large numbers of children. By the 1830s, British and American entrepreneurs were getting rich selling opium to these Chinese addicts. And when the Chinese government ordered them to stop, the British invaded, sending gunboats to Chinese ports and blockading the Pearl River. The British destroyed Chinese warships and looted entire cities. And once China was defeated militarily, China was forced to sign this treaty in 1842. It's the first of what the Chinese call the unequal treaties. And it gave the British control over Hong Kong Island. After it took the island, it used this perfect port city to ship drugs more efficiently.
Hong Kong was built on stolen land from the Opium Wars that Britain, the U.S., France, Germany, the great powers of the time, but particularly Britain, imposed on China. And it was a demand under the name of free trade to sell opium in massive quantities throughout China. And when China resisted that, there was an invading army that literally looted the capital, the major cities, the ports of China.
During the entire British era, which lasts until 1997, there was a de facto kind of apartheid that existed in Hong Kong. Chinese people were treated like third-class citizens.
Somehow it's been lost in this that Hong Kong was stolen from China by the British Empire as part of a broader attempt to actually weaken China as a major world power, which is maybe the most anti-democratic thing you could think of, right? An empire just coming in and just stealing a part of a country.
In 1984, the Chinese and the British signed a joint declaration stating that China would resume its sovereignty over Hong Kong on July 1st, 1997, and that Hong Kong would exist under a policy called One Country, Two Systems. Britain's requirements for returning Hong Kong to China included no protections for democracy, but did, however, include protections for private property and provisions that Hong Kong would continue to operate as an outpost of Western capitalism.
The two systems, one country, that was imposed or demanded by Britain, put into place and enshrined capitalist property relations in the harshest and strictest way. It means that 20% of the population is living in utter destitute poverty and no plan in place in terms of housing, jobs, and social development to really change this. Almost 15% of the population ranks as millionaires, 20% in utter poverty, and a huge middle grouping terrified of falling off the cliff.
From 1843 to 1985, the year after the Joint Declaration, there were no elections of any kind, and the first direct election didn't take place in Hong Kong until 1991.
It was at that time, after this Sino-British declaration, that they decided, well, we better introduce some elements of democracy. Now, prior to that, all officials in Hong Kong were just appointed by the Crown, so completely colonial, completely anti-democratic. What we see now, the current electoral system, the vast majority of that form of universal suffrage has been brought in post-1997. That is after the return of the sovereignty of the People's Republic of China. And it was directly connected to the idea that Britain wanted to create the illusion that, well, Hong Kong, the way we've run it, is democratic, as opposed to this undemocratic, authoritarian, communist government in China.
But to fully understand the unrest in Hong Kong taking place today, we must look at Hong Kong's underlying social and economic inequalities, as well as its political landscape. Let's tackle the social and economic inequalities first. Although Hong Kong is known internationally as being very wealthy and prosperous, that's not the case for all its residents. Over 1.3 million people live under the poverty line here. Over 250,000 people live in what Soko calls inadequate housing. And over 40% of Hong Kong residents live in either public housing or subsidized housing. Soko is one of Hong Kong's largest social services organizations, and Silai Shan, a community organizer with them, showed us what some of these inadequate housing units look like these subdivided flats, and these caged homes. In a subdivided flat, your bed is your living space. Kitchens and bathrooms are shared, in this flat, by 24 people. Silai Shan thinks that some of the blame for the lack of affordable housing in Hong Kong gets misdirected to Beijing when it belongs with Hong Kong's own property developers.
With the land reform, the resistance is mainly from within Hong Kong society. This includes property developers who control a lot of land.
I spoke with Tek Chi Yuen, the former vice chair of the largest so-called pro-democracy party in Hong Kong, the Hong Kong Democrats. He says that he left that party because of its unwillingness to even have any dialogue with Beijing. He thinks that many Hong Kongers see democracy and government representation as their ticket to gaining better housing and living conditions. And that while the extradition law amendment may have been the trigger for this anti-government movement, it was never the full story.
The price of housing going up very fast. That means the rich people get more and more. The distribution of resources is unfair. So the young people angry about this. This is the fundamental problem. This is the root problem.
This inequality and the low standard of living in Hong Kong are virtually absent from coverage of the anti-government movement. And who's to blame for this? Well, Oxfam suggests that a responsibility lays not at the foot of Beijing, but at the local Hong Kong government. Raises to the minimum wage fall behind the rate of inflation, and privatization often runs unchecked.
The level of economic inequality in Hong Kong is rather staggering. The housing crisis in Hong Kong in some ways dwarfs the housing crisis in equivalent U.S. cities, such as Los Angeles and in New York. The real estate industry in Hong Kong is perhaps even more potent than its counterpart in Manhattan that produced the 45th U.S. president. At the same time, you have countless numbers of poor people who are barely getting by. You have people living in what we might consider virtual closets, paying an arm and a leg to do so.
Now, to compare, the top 12 Chinese companies on the Fortune 500 list are all either state-owned or subsidized. They include massive oil, solar, energy, telecommunications, engineering, and construction companies.
There's a stark contrast between Chinese policy, social policy, and Hong Kong social policy when it comes to this. Hong Kong, even though it has had a budget surplus, recently, it is unwilling to spend to reduce the high levels of inequality, to improve the employment outlook, the outlook for the elderly and the homeless. And this is really putting a strain on people's everyday lives. A lot of younger people are really discontented with the level of inequality that exists in Hong Kong.
For the past 10 years, wages in Hong Kong have been stagnant, while rents have increased 300%. But the official demands of the anti-government movement are all about Beijing. They seem divorced from issues of economic inequality.
The demands of this group certainly aren't dealing with many of the problems that those of us in America who also are opposed to the worst ravages of capitalism would recognize as real problems. And then two, you see who they're meeting with. Are progressive people anywhere in the world, climbing over one another to be meeting with the Republican high command? So I think that even though there are certainly valid grievances for people to be on the street, this movement is not really about that. It's about a broader attempt to promote really a form of dismembering of China.
In fact, the single largest labor organization in Hong Kong is actually against this protest movement. It's called the Hong Kong Federation of Trade Unions.
The original movement has been eroded. Now, it's just about opposition to the Chinese government. Now, it's a color revolution.
When it comes to inequality, Hong Kong is not alone. Oxfam says that 82% of the wealth created on Earth in 2017 went to the world's richest 1%. This kind of growing poverty worldwide creates conditions ripe for unrest, and unfortunately sets the stage for foreign forces to co-opt these sentiments. The youth in Hong Kong are facing the same issues as the youth in the West. Rising cost of housing, diminishing job opportunities. But why are the youth in Hong Kong railing against Beijing, who doesn't control the Hong Kong economy? Although there seems to have been a conscious choice to brand this surge of protests as a leaderless movement, individuals, political parties, and organizations are giving this movement its direction. And U.S. officials and organizations are openly colluding with this opposition. At the center of this controversy is a man named Jimmy Lai. His media company owns one of Hong Kong's most widely read publications, Apple Daily. As protests were heating up this summer, Lai went to Washington, D.C. and met with U.S. Vice President Mike Pence, U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, and U.S. National Security Advisor John Bolton. He was also hosted by the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, a neoconservative think tank that hosts a board of advisors that include 2 former CIA directors. Then in August, Lai was seen meeting in Hong Kong with a man named Christian Whiten, who worked at the U.S. State Department under both the Bush and Trump administrations. Here's Whiten on a podcast later that month.
Causing this crisis for the Chinese Communist Party, for the government, at a time when we're, frankly, at a difficult point in negotiations. This is good for U.S. national interest.
Also present at this meeting was Mark Simon, Jimmy Lai's so-called right-hand man, who's an ex-Navy SEAL with ties to the CIA, although he says he's not a spy. Another curious figure in the anti-government movement is Martin Lee, who was present at this August meeting as well. He's the founding chairman of Hong Kong's Democratic Party, the largest pan-democratic party, the clique of political parties in Hong Kong that's been called anti-China.
Their policy basically is anti-China, and they do things which are really hurtful to the overall public interest of Hong Kong.
The Pan-Democrats would go on to win 7 in 10 votes that November in Hong Kong's local elections, but Beijing says that the opposition and its young agitators were stopping people from going to the ballot box. Martin Lee's connections to Washington go back decades. As the current protest movement was heating up, Lee also took a Washington and met with U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. Lee is the recipient of a number of awards from U.S. institutions, including a 1997 Democracy Award from the National Endowment for Democracy. Although the NED is technically an NGO, it has received millions of dollars from the U.S. State Department. And critics of the NED point to the fact that one of its former presidents said it was created to continue the work of the CIA without the CIA's stigma. Additionally, NED co-founder Alan Weinstein admitted that a lot of what the endowment does today was done covertly in the past by the CIA. I asked Lee about his party's alleged ties to the U.S. government.
We have been very careful. We don't take overseas donations because that's not allowed with any foreign political party or political group.
It may be illegal for a party to take money from a foreign government, but from a foreign non-governmental organization, that's another story.
That's not illegal, definitely. There are gray areas, An NGO, giving money in the cause of promoting democracy, there's nothing we can do about it.
There's also nothing to be done about donations from individuals. Individuals like Jimmy Lai, who donated to the Hong Kong Pan-Democratic Camp to the tune of millions. Then there's Joshua Wong, who appears in the press as a leader of this protest movement. Wong became the face of the anti-China movement in Hong Kong several years ago, and both he and Martin Lee have been honored by Freedom House, a subsidiary of the NED. Wong has met with Nancy Pelosi, Marco Rubio, and was most recently spotted meeting with a U.S. State Department official in July.
The National Endowment for Democracy takes U.S. taxpayer money. It literally funds foreign political parties. It gives training to people who end up, going on violent rampages through the country. It literally funds the salaries of foreign politicians. It brings them over to meet with Mike Pompeo. The National Endowment for Democracy, along with USAID, which is more closely tied to the U.S. government, they're completely and fully responsible for keeping these protests alive and keeping the lifeblood of money flowing through countries that the U.S. wants to overthrow.
It's quite curious that Senator Ted Cruz of Texas, a known conservative, has joined the protesters in Hong Kong. And what's even more curious is that in Mr. Cruz's own Texas, you've had police shoot black citizens in their homes, and yet we have not seen Senator Cruz join the massive protests against police misconduct against citizens that he's sworn to represent.
The U.S. is seeking to strike China through its soft underbelly. The U.S. is interested in destabilizing China because they believe that they'll get an advantage. They're afraid of the rise of China as a global power. You know, the U.S. worldwide strategy is to prevent the rise of any rivals, and so we'll expend no limit of money to try to prevent that.
So why is the U.S. supporting an anti-government movement in Hong Kong? Well, maybe we should take a look at what's been actualized by this movement so far. Both the House and the Senate have approved their version of the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act. Let's take a closer look at exactly what this law would do. The Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act claims to support the democratic aspirations of Hong Kongers. But what it really does is lay the groundwork for further U.S. sanctions and intervention. For one thing, the bill cites the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which is a treaty that China has yet to ratify. That means it's not legally binding under international law. The bill also cites Hong Kong Basic Law 45, the provision of Hong Kong's law that states that the ultimate aim is the selection of the chief executive by universal suffrage. The United States says it wants Hong Kong to follow Basic Law 45. But any examination of Basic Law 45 reveals that implementing such universal suffrage should be done in light of the actual situation in Hong Kong. Still, the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act threatens to punish China if it doesn't accelerate this timeline. The bill also threatens sanctions if Hong Kong does follow Hong Kong Basic Law. It says the U.S. will sanction Hong Kong if the Hong Kong government enacts a new law regarding national security pursuant to Article 23 of Basic Law. Article 23 of Basic Law gives Hong Kong the authority to prohibit acts of treason and subversion against China. It also prevents foreign police from conducting political activities and Hong Kong political parties from establishing ties with foreign political parties. Additionally, the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act mandates the president to make a list of people for the U.S. to blacklist from entering the country. It gives the U.S. the authority to seize the assets of anyone on this list, Chinese or otherwise. And anyone who tries to get around the U.S. confiscating their possessions can be fined by up to $1 million. It's for this reason the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act has been called a money grab. What's more, the bill states that protesters in Hong Kong won't have any problems getting U.S. visas, regardless of what crimes may have been committed. Why is Congress proactively informing Hong Kong citizens that they could get a U.S. visa regardless of what crimes have been committed? Why is Congress trying to punish China for violating a treaty that isn't legally binding, and Hong Kong for enacting its own laws? Why is this bill trying to force China to accelerate its own timeline for granting Hong Kong universal suffrage when no timeline is provided by Hong Kong Basic Law? And why does Congress want to allow foreign influence in Hong Kong?
What is the aim of this sanctions vote? It really is an effort to totally sabotage Hong Kong. Demonstrators, they're not demanding democracy. Imagine, they're demanding sanctions on their own city. Sanctions everywhere in the world is economic warfare, and it's strangulation. Why on earth would anyone in Hong Kong make a demand that sanctions be passed on Hong Kong? There is an agenda. They may not be aware. These are young people without a future, and that's because of what has been imposed on them from the West.
You know, in the late 90s, the U.S. passed the Iraq Freedom Act, the Syria Freedom Act, the Libya Liberation Act. What legislation like this is meant to do is to establish a baseline upon which to build and to get further and further down the road of U.S. intervention and sanctions.
The Chinese economy has been growing 3 times faster than the United States for the last 30 years. The standard of living of the average Chinese worker has been growing much, much faster than anything that the average American worker experiences. The Chinese have figured out how to do the thing that is the most urgent need of the people of this world, which is to stop being poor and to become comfortable and to have a modern industrial economy. They are doing that. They are the ascending power in the world. Everybody knows that, and that means they challenge the United States because our dominance, the dominance of the United States, which has been in existence roughly a century, is now heading down.
The Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act is now law. Beijing may soon send in troops to act as peacekeepers to make sure the city doesn't destroy itself. But in Hong Kong, tourists have disappeared. The city's economy is grinding to a halt. Against the backdrop of an unprecedented economic war between a now dominant United States and a rising China, Hong Kong's future hangs in the balance.